Without further ado, please welcome Lee Drouhard.
Hi, my name's Lee. I'm going to be performing my poem, and it's called Birds. There are many different birds. Each is so unique. They sit upon the phone wire, chirping as we speak. Not one bird looks quite the same as others of its kind. Some will appear rather plain, while others brightly shine. Sometimes we chase the birds away because their colors are not to our liking. But the birds come back every day, with their appearance still more striking. Every bird sounds different, their cheeps and chirps and squeaks. But all these changes do not stop the birds from coming to meet. Yes, each and every bird, with differences so stark, all live on this earth, each with their own heart. So when I look up at these birds and hear their singing sound, I wonder how they have the strength to fly as the world spins round, with their wings of wind to carry on their song, and the strength in their hearts with no fear of being wrong. As I look at my world in all of its sorrow, I look back at these birds who care not for tomorrow, and as they continue to fly on, completely careless and free, I wonder where they go, if they are flying from me. So when I look up at the sky, I find myself hoping for them to fall.
Awesome. Thanks again, Lee. We are already looking for students to present at Writers Expo 2024. So two things here. Number one, if you're interested, let me know. And number two, when you get back from spring break, I know no one really wants to think about that right now, but when you get back from spring break, you can look in your email for a Google form for me and Dr. Reef. And if you would like to present a poem or another piece of writing perhaps next year, even if you don't have it written yet, but you're thinking, I'd like to do that. That would be a good step forward. On that form that you'll be able to submit to us, you can say so, okay? All right, well, let's get to the main act. So, as I said, first period, I've been waiting for this for 9 months. I'm very excited for today. Today's main presenter is a New York Times best-selling author, the Hazelwood series, and now recently a YA novel called Our Crooked Hearts. She's got another one coming out in February, she was telling us last period. Her work has been translated into more than 20 languages already and has been included in the New York Times list of notable children's books. She also happens to be a graduate of Libertyville High School. Please welcome Melissa Albert. Okay, so we're making a little bit of a last-minute change, perhaps. We'll see. We were asked at the end of last period to maybe have Melissa read something. For those of you who haven't read her work before, to have her read something from one of her books, and I gave her the task literally like 3 minutes ago, asking, can you do that? And she said, yeah, maybe, let's. So what's the answer? Yeah, we're good? Okay. Do you want a mic stand for this, or you good? Okay.
Okay, I'm going to read you something from the Hazelwood, because I think I can cut it off quicker. And I'm so happy to be here, so thank you so much for coming to see me talk. This is my debut novel. It's about a girl whose grandmother wrote this cult collection of fairy tales, and she's never met her grandmother, but she's like obsessed with this idea. And then the world behind the fairy tales starts to kind of like chase and terrorize her, and she has to figure out why. So, I haven't looked at this book in a while, so I'm nervous. My mother was raised on fairy tales, but I was raised on highways. My first memory is the smell of hot pavement and the sky through the sunroof whipping by in a river of blue. My mom tells me that's impossible. Our car doesn't have a sunroof. But I can still close my eyes and see it, so I'm holding on to it. We've crossed the country 100 times in our beater car that smells like French fries and stale coffee and plasticky strawberries from the day I fed my Tinkerbell lipstick into the slats of the heater vent. We stayed in so many places with so many people that I never really learned the concept of stranger danger. which is why, when I was 6 years old, I got into an old blue Buick with a red-headed man I'd never met and drove with him for 14 hours straight, plus 2 stops for bathroom breaks and 1 for pancakes, before the cops pulled us over, tipped off by a waitress who recognized my description from the radio. By then, I'd figured out the man wasn't who he said he was, a friend of my grandmother, Althea, taking me to see her. Althea was already secluded in her big house then, and I'd never met her. She had no friends, just fans, and my mother told me that's what the man was, a fan who wanted to use me to get to my grandma. After they determined I hadn't been assaulted, after the red-headed man was identified as a drifter who'd stolen a car a few miles from the place we were staying in Utah, my mother decided we'd never talk about it again. She didn't want to hear it when I told her the man was kind, that he'd told me stories and had a warm laugh that made me believe, deep in my 6-year-old's heart, he was actually my father come to claim me. She'd been shown the red-headed man in custody through a one-way mirror and swore she'd never seen him before. For a few years, I'd persisted in believing he was my dad. When we left Utah after his arrest to live for a few months in an artist retreat outside of Tempe, I worried he wouldn't be able to find me again. He never did. By the time I turned 9, I'd recognized my secret belief for what it was, a child's fantasy. I folded it away like I did all the things I didn't need, old toys, bedtime superstitions, clothes that didn't fit. My mom and I lived like vagrants, staying with friends till our welcome wore through at the elbows, perching in precarious places, then moving on. We didn't have the luxury of being nostalgic. We didn't have a chance to stand still. Until the year I turned 17 and Althea died in the Hazelwood. Thank you.
All right, so you said you hadn't looked at that in a while. How's it feel reading it?
I feel like that opening I've probably read 9,000 times, like just in edits. So it felt like getting back on a bike, I guess.
Do you ever feel the urge? I've always wondered this about authors. Once it's in print, right? It's in print. Do you ever just feel that urge or that wish that you could go back and change something?
Oh yeah, that's why I don't look.
Smart. Okay, so we're gonna kind of stick to the script a little bit here because, like I said, Mrs. Singleton's class, you guys did wonderful work with these questions. We're gonna run through these in some sort of order that I've thrown together. But the rest of you, if you have questions that you would like to ask Melissa, there is going to be plenty of time for that. So when we get to it, just make sure you raise your hand really high because I can't always see very well, okay? Let's just start with this because this was a very common question that they had. What sparked your interest in writing and when did you know you wanted to become a writer?
So what sparked my interest in writing, of course, was reading. I read everything I could get my hands on as a kid. I read like the weird, corny garbage on my parents' shelves. I read like anything I could find at the library. I read and read and read. But the stuff that really stuck with me especially was C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia. That notion of being in the real world where it's like gray and boring and then like stepping through a magic door. Like I never forgot that. And Peter Pan, which again is another kind of like portal fantasy. You're in like a London nursery and then you're in Neverland. So those books were incredibly, I don't know, they just like built me when I was a kid. That was like my taste. And then in high school, the books were Neil Gaiman was a huge one for me and Francesca Lia Block. So just fantastical, creepy, dark worlds. That's like what my taste was. But there was another part of the question. Oh, how did I want to become a writer? When I was a kid, I loved to write stories. When I got a little older, I was aware that I wasn't very good at it, and I found that kind of like pushed me away a little bit because I didn't want to work very hard. I figured if it didn't come out like really good, that meant you weren't a writer. And then later, through like a lot of trial and error, I learned that you actually have to work to make it sound good. It just doesn't come out as good as you hope. So it was like a really slow and painful process. And it wasn't until I was in my 20s that I decided, like, I've been a reader all my life. I'm kind of like working adjacent to books, that I decided to take a try at writing. And it was like incredibly humbling to try to sit down and write a novel for the first time because I thought it would like come really naturally. But I remember like the first day I sat down to do it, I was trying to get a character to like walk across the room and out a door. And I was like, she stood up, walked toward the door, put her hand out, turned the knob, pulled, and I'm like, this can't be right. There's gotta be, oh, so I started reading other people's books and almost like kind of diagramming them. Like, how do you get a character from one room to the next? How do you, once I was trying to get someone out of the water and into a boat, and for like 2 days, and then I just cut the scene with the boat. So yeah, I just started, I was a reader all my life, and it wasn't until I decided to like try to become a novelist that I became like a reader with intent, like looking at books as, I don't know, like secret maps or something to like how to actually do it. And then I started like really reading and writing kind of in tandem, like figuring out, learning like in my mid-20s how to actually do it.
You mentioned an author last period, this period. I'm hoping I'm getting it right. Francesca Leah Block. Can you guys raise your hand if you know who that author is? Okay. I am not familiar with that author either. Can you tell us a little bit about her?
Okay, she's this really cool, like, Los Angeles witch punk woman, which, you know, in like the late 90s was the coolest thing I could think of. So she writes these weird kind of magical realism fantasies set in LA with like kids who grew up around Hollywood and like going to shows, and just very cool, very magical, and it's very poetic. It's no longer to my taste. It's like a little bit too poetic for me, but if you're at all a poetry reader and you like fantasy, you definitely got to pick it up. Start with a Weetsy Bat.
Well, it makes sense to hear you say that too, because as I was reading your writing, I think some of the students kind of touched on this too. You get this sense of poetry. Like there are phrases. I remember I was talking with Dr. Reef about a moment where, Dr. Reef, I hope I get this right now. It was something like the character's voice sounded like the stars, right? And I'm like, that's like something out of poetry, you know? I mean, so that makes a lot of sense. Do you find yourself? You talk about the struggle, that moment of writing a character getting up and going to the door. How do you balance that like concrete need for stuff versus that desire to write something more poetic?
That's a good question, and I'm still working on that. I feel like every book I write, I'm trying to draw a little closer to the bone, make it a little less poetic and a little more concrete, but it's a very slow process. Because I like a nice sentence. I like a nice metaphor. I just do, it's my taste. But I'm getting like a little more austere, and I'm trying to draw back from that a bit. But nothing I've published reflects that to this point. It's like pretty...
I was gonna say, I think Our Crooked Hearts, it felt...
Is it a little spare?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, that was deliberate. I'm working on it.
Cool. Okay, so the students were wondering, where do you get your ideas from? It sounds like reading is a big inspiration for you. Are there others?
Yeah, reading is a big one. Just like those weird little what ifs you get in your head. I'm trying to think. Oh, okay, like I worked at a bookstore in Chicago called Powell's, which is now closed. It was the one on Lincoln Avenue. It's an awesome bookstore. And we would always find the weirdest stuff inside books that people sold to us. Like photographs and like weird playing cards from like odd decks and like love letters and Christmas cards. It was fun. And I had this idea, just like, what if one day, see, you think creepy things, you gotta write them down. I said, what if one day I like open one of these used books and there was a photo of me inside? Why would that be? So in the Hazelwood, this like happens to the character. She like, there's a book and there's a Polaroid of her inside of it. And that I made it work in the plot, but it came out of like this little creepy notion I had. So I feel like that kind of stuff is always bubbling up in your brain. These like weird what ifs, these moments when you like embroider on reality. I don't know if any of you were, there's always like that one kid in grade school who's like the pathological liar. I feel like those kids probably become storytellers. Like my son's 5, and his friend in his class, he's like, the sun is gonna explode tomorrow, but it's okay because I have superpowers. And I'm like, you're a storyteller. So yeah, it's just all that odd little bubbling in your head. You could like start taking notes and eventually find what you want to write about.
Well, so that's what I was just wondering, and a total random thought occurred to me, and I'm blanking on the actor's name now. Actor, writer, Garden State. He was in Scrubs.
Zach Braff.
That guy. talked about how he would keep a notebook with him at all times for those moments that bubbled up so that he would have them when he needed them. Do you have something like that, or?
Oh yeah, I have all these story starts and all these like ideas, and all the books I've written have started from a really tiny seed. So I used to think as a writer that the only way to write a book was if you had a super genius idea, so cool and explosive that you could, like, in one sentence, like the Hunger Games, like you could explain it like that and make $1 million. But then I realized it's actually more about sitting down with something like very small, starting to write and seeing what comes out of it.
I have a feeling I know the answer to this question, but Daniel, Ava, and I'm sorry folks, I didn't ask you your names and how to pronounce them ahead of time. I should have done that. Aryaman, Carolyn, they were wondering how you got, and it sounds like reading might be a part of this, but how did you get into the horror suspense genre? And maybe as a writer, how did that happen?
So I guess it's just kind of what I was reading. No, I went through this period where all I read was like really smart literary fiction, because I don't know who I was showing off for. I was like in my early 20s. I felt like I needed to read whatever. And then I remembered that what I really love is fantasy. And then I was like, also I love like this tacky thriller. I love genre. I love suspense, horror, mystery, fantasy. That's like where my heart is. And when I started to try to become a writer, that was the stuff I knew I had to like immerse myself in reading, because it's what I wanted to write. As far as the horror, that kind of happened unexpectedly. I didn't realize when I sat down to work that I would delve into like the creepy stuff as much as I ended up enjoying.
So you mentioned you've got another book coming out in February. You mentioned last period that you felt like the young adult world was kind of moving away from you, something along those lines, and you're thinking about writing something a little bit more for adults. Do you think you'll stay in the same genre?
Oh yeah. So I feel like YA fantasy now is big, amazing kind of invented worlds like the Grishaverse, which I love, like with Leigh Bardugo. And it's like a little less contemporary weird fantasy. So yeah, but I will always stay in contemporary speculative.
Okay, so Ruhi, Kate, Theo, Emma were wondering, and I think this is based on maybe the Tales from the Hinterland. It seems as if various myths or mythologies have inspired you, or at least you've been drawing from them, it seems, in your writing. Could you maybe just talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so I grew up reading the colored fairy books, which are like the blue fairy book, the red fairy book. They're all different colors of their binding, and they were collected from around the world, and they were for kids in another century. I forget exactly when they were published, but it was this kind of array of tales from everywhere. So there were like the classics that we know of and like oddities from elsewhere, and all of these different mythologies mashed together was like very exciting to me. And then I love also modern takes on this, like Neil Gaiman's Anansi Boys, or honestly, there's like so much happening in YA that's really exciting. Like Elizabeth Lim writes about Chinese mythology, and like Rashid Chakshi's work, and there's just such exciting modern takes happening on mythology that it's exciting to read the old and the new and kind of like draw from stuff from both.
What's the best way, do you think, for high schoolers to find a book or a genre or something like that they themselves are interested in?
I mean, read widely. Read widely and try to let go of your notion of what you should be reading, or what is like, I don't know. I used to feel like I should be the person who was reading, for some reason the Communist Manifesto was really big when I was in high school. My friends and I all read the Communist Manifesto. I don't know why. We thought it was cool. In retrospect, this is the worst thing I've ever read. It's so boring. Why did I read it? So I can hold it up like this and look cool. So I guess find the books that you don't want to hold up like this. Find the books you want to like read under your covers until like 5 a.m. with your phone light on. And that that is the stuff that's gonna like pull that part of you out. That part of you that's like, oh my God, I could do this. I could do some version of this. Like, what's my thing that I'm gonna feel this strongly about that I want to write?
So you've said that you were quite the reader, even at a young age. I'm sure there had to have been a moment in school, high school, whenever, when you're assigned to read a book and you start it and you're like, oh gosh. What did you do then?
You faked it? You you skimmed it?
Wrong answer.
I've never read Huck Finn, and yet I have gotten a B on tests about it. Yeah, that is the wrong answer. I'm sorry. You read it. No. Yeah, I would hate the idea that you would get so turned off by a book that you're just like, I don't even enjoy reading, which I meet a lot of people. I do a lot of this moderation for when people's books come out, I'll interview them at bookstores about it. And sometimes I'll be like, what did you read in high school? And they'll be like, I hated books in high school. The assigned reading was so awful, I didn't read until college. I'm sure LHS's assigned reading is not like that. But just that notion of having your reading spirit crushed, I would say do your best to get through the assigned reading you don't connect with and find books you love to treat yourself, you know?
What do you do if you start a book now and you're not into it? Page 25, do you keep going or
Never,
okay.
no. In fact, by page 10, I'm ruthless. So you need a hooky start and a good voice, or I will never read you. Yeah.
That's fair. My professor in college, the last day of class one time, he said, I want you to calculate out the number of years you think you have left on this planet. It was very kind of morbid, but he's like, and then calculate out how many books you think you can read a year and do the math. And he's like, why waste your time on one that you're not into? So I think, yeah, that's really cool. Okay, so Matthew, Alice, Max, and Jack said that from their observations, a lot of your stories have, let's just say, less than great family lives, and some are just straight up bad. Where does that come from?
I thought you were going to say some of your stories are less than great, and I was like, oh,
No.
I got to answer this? Yes, less than great families. Well, if we're talking about the fairy tales, then that is the DNA of fairy tales. Terrible, terrible family dynamics. Yeah, there's just no way around it in a fairy tale. You can't be like, my wonderful parents sent me to the woods to die. It was a mistake. That's how a fairy tale begins. You need an impetus to get out of your terrible house.
Now it's reminding me of all those Disney movies, too, with various stuff like that. But anyway, okay, so another group, Sophie, Evelyn, Tiona, Shagun, said, it seems as if nature is constantly popping up in your stories. Do you feel like there's any reason for that?
Ooh. Yeah, nature is so creepy and inexorable and it doesn't care about you. And I feel like magic is the same, right? It's unstoppable, indomitable, uncontrollable. You can try to tame it, you'll fail over time. Think of those pictures people make of what the world would look like if we all died out. And within 50 years, the world would be this flourishing wonderland. They don't need us. Nature. So maybe it's kind of the same as if magic existed, that's how it would be. Plus it's just fun to write something set in a contemporary world at a gas station, but then you look up and you see the moon. I love those juxtapositions have always excited me as a reader, so I play with them as a writer.
Okay, so on the vein of nature, your recent book, Our Crooked Hearts, rabbits, let's just say, are kind of a central figure or role. And I think another class later on was wondering, but I'm going to ask you now, why rabbits? How did that come about?
I can tell. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so...
maybe no spoiler alerts, but...
Oh, no. When I lived in Chicago, this is a while back, someone in my neighborhood was beheading birds and putting sticks through their bodies in a cross shape. And I called I called 311, the non-emergency line, and the person's like, oh my God, call 911, this is the occult. And I was like, that's what I was thinking. So I call 911, and they're like, ma'am, this is Chicago's emergency line. We're gonna come check out your dead bird art. So that was the end of that conversation. I never was murdered by this neighbor, happily. That was my fear. This obviously stuck in my head. This is a horrible, image. So when I sat down to write this book, it was a little too creepy for me. But then like just a regular dead bird wasn't creepy enough. And I thought like a rabbit. That's very witchy, and it's a very witchy book. So I am unkind to rabbits in this book. It almost got out of control. Like, I don't know how it happened, but the plot called for it, and I didn't have anything else I could do. Sometimes that will happen. The plot will get away from you, and you'll put stuff in you didn't know was coming. But I will say I had a pet rabbit. His name was Silky Pinky Albert. I named him when I was quite small. I like rabbits. Let's leave it at that. I have no problem with them in real life, just in fiction.
So it was tough to do some of that to the rabbits in the book, I would imagine.
Knowing, I have an author friend who is like, I killed one dog in a book 10 years ago and I still get hate mail. She's like, you're bold. And I was like, well, I'm not going to kill a dog. That's the line I won't cross.
Did you, for the recent book, with so much witch occult stuff, did you have to do quite a bit of research on some stuff? Or?
I like went back in my mind to when I was 13 and I was becoming a witch in my mind. And I went to like Cook Memorial and got all their witch books out. Like I was going to find some grimoire of like ultimate power. I didn't, but I found some history books about witches and tried to do some spells, but it never worked out. But I had like this repository of like misty information in the back of my head. And I thought that combined with a little bit of research I read a lot about superstitions, which if you ever look up like an internet compendium of superstitions, it's like if you see a bird, you're gonna die tomorrow. If you wear red, you're gonna die tomorrow. Like it's just the explanation of like life before modern medicine. It's like literally anything that you see, it's like death is coming. So that was really good reading for writing a creepy witchy book.
Maddie, Andy, Eddie, and Sarah noticed that, and I'm not sure, guys, if this was because of the Tales of the Hinterland or if this was from one of the novels, but they noticed that a lot of times your stories have this sort of closure but not element to them.
Yeah.
Purposeful?
Yeah, so at the end of the Hazelwood, which I did finish not knowing that I'd write a sequel, but still, I had just seen Stranger Things season 1. And I don't know if you guys remember the last shot of that. I won't spoil it, it's years later, but nevertheless, there's like a character who has this like moment of, you think he's totally fine, but there's like the supernatural flash. So I wanted to give the end of the Hazelwood like the same vibe. Like, I think the story's over, but like there's like that moment of creepy. I just love that open door. Something creepy could happen. Do I love it as a reader? I don't actually know, but I like doing it as a writer.
That's cool. Tyler, Adler, and Lena were wondering, again, I haven't read but a couple of the, I admit, Tales from the Hinterland, but they observed some older English used in the dialogue. Was that difficult? Is there a specific reason for that? Did you have to do research about that? How did that come
Yeah, and the tales, definitely dropping into that voice was it was kind of like a discomforting process. You really have to like bring your mind to the space to write dialogue that seems fitting for a fairy tale. So I was just trying to kind of like fit it to how fairy tale characters talk, or how I imagine they would.
You mentioned last hour that you have a group of people who you work with, sharing your writing, getting feedback. With something so niche like that, right? Like older words or the occult, right? Did you find that they were able to give you the feedback that you wanted when you were working on those projects, or?
I never got so granular as commenting on things like dialogue or use of magic. The stuff that I have friends who are like writers themselves or editors or whatever who read my work and kind of like will brainstorm stuff with me like plot fixes, and it's stuff like, would that character do that? What would that character do next? Like plotting, pacing is rushed, that kind of thing. It doesn't get as granular, usually is like line by line.
Gotcha, okay. Ava, Caroline, Max, and Joey were wondering what has been the hardest part of your journey to becoming an author?
Oh my God. So I talked last period a little bit about the hope to despair cycle, which I feel like I'm constantly living in this space of either feeling like I'm a genius or like I should never write another word. And I think those highs and lows are pretty common with creative work. And it used to be that a bad writing day or reading my own bad unedited work would make me like so sad that I couldn't write again for like months. Now I'm tightening the loop. So it's like the longer I work, the quicker I can like bounce back and convince myself to try again. So it's totally, the biggest block is 100% mental, and it's absolutely losing your fear of being very bad. Because I thought you just wrote and it was good, and if it wasn't, you weren't good, but it turns out it's bad, better, good, so that's how it works.
Are there days when the fear wins, and what do you do on those days?
I have the luxury of occasionally letting the fear win, because I quit my job in 2019 to do this full time. So I do have time for some of those bad days. And if I'm smart, I'll do something with it, like read a book or go to the museum. I live by a museum that I can just walk to and walk around. So that's like the dream idea of what I do, but more likely I'll just like cycle internet stuff. So, but I try not to. But sometimes the fear wins, yeah.
Does being a mom help or hurt?
It helps because my time is more precious. So like my day is bookended by my kid leaving and coming back. So if I had like 24-hour schedule and could like stay up late, I would keep weird hours, and I think I would be less productive.
Cool. All right, I'm going to pause here and open it up for some questions. So if you have something you would like to ask Melissa, feel free to raise your hand. Yeah, hi would be good, unless you're in the front, in which case we can probably see you. Yeah, go for it.
Ooh, thank you for asking. Okay, so it's called The Bad Ones, and it is a supernatural horror thriller about 4 people disappear from a suburb in one night, and the best friend of one of the vanished people is like setting off to discover what exactly has happened. And first she thinks her best friend ran away, and then she thinks maybe she's a victim of something, and then ultimately she thinks like, what if she's the instigator of like what the happened? And she realizes it's all tied in with this like folkloric goddess figure that has figured into their childhood games. And it is called The Bad Ones, and it's out in February. And I'm giving a copy of Our Crooked Hearts to every first question asked per period, and it's so easy to hand it to you. Yeah, thank you.
Melissa, I'm always curious when authors come out with a new book, what the mentality is. Is it, this is the best thing I've ever written because it's the most recent thing I've ever written, or is it like gosh, I don't even know how this is going to be received, Is it anxiety? Is it confidence?
It's like all of that. There's like the idea with every book that you're like, I'm definitely better at writing than the last book, but have I written something? There's like good writing and there's like commercially interesting writing, and those are not always the same thing. So I guess it's like the idea of, have I written something that people want to read right now? Like I have a friend who right before Twilight came out wrote this brilliant vampire novel that nobody read. And then Twilight hit, and he's like, I was 2 years early. Yeah, that happens.
Can you give us your honest thoughts on Twilight?
Can I give you honest thoughts on?
Twilight?
Okay, so I have not myself read it, but I have seen the movies. Sorry guys, I know. I told my friend this the other day, and she's like, I was raised on Twilight. Twilight is what I am. She's herself writing a vampire novel. I guess I read some of the first one, and the smallest thing can turn you off. Bella kept screaming things, like, something, I screamed, and I was like, nobody screams them. I don't know. I guess, as you say, life is short, and like the weirdest things can turn you off a book. Believe me, I know, because people tell me on social media what turned them off about my books, so I know. They like tag me in. Why are you tagging me in? So I think that Twilight is a gateway drug for a world of books, and that you should 100% give it a try, even if it wasn't for me.
All right. I can't believe we haven't even talked about this. How in the world, as an author, do you deal with people on social media? I mean, I'm sure there's some wonderful people on social media, but at the same time, I imagine there's got to be some just hurtful stuff.
Well, you lie at events and say, I never look at my reviews, but I'll tell you guys the truth, because I went to school here. You look until it becomes actually affecting of your mood, which I would hit that point. Like you read like nice reviews and then you accidentally see a bad one and it erases the 50 nice reviews you read. So yeah, there's like a balance to be found, and it can be difficult to not look.
I believe there was a hand up in the middle of the audience here a second ago. No? Yeah, there we go. Go for it.
Like me?
Yes.
How do you develop your characters? Because obviously you spend so much time with them. Do you feel like they're like almost like real?
Oh, that's a good question. So it's so funny. In first drafts, I find that my characters are very one note. They'll be like, I'm the mean dad, and like, I'm the whatever, I'm the cute, something. And then as I edit, the dialogue becomes less ridiculously sharp and more ambiguous. And like, I realize that the character who's mean doesn't know they're mean. For me, it's just that editing process of like seeing how one note a character can begin and kind of imbuing them with their dignity of being a human that's more than like the one note. A trick that I've heard is to think about the fact that every character is the hero of their own story. So if you've got a character who seems ridiculously flat, it's like, well, what do they want? What do they think and need? And it's helpful to just mentally, like for a second, center them.
Are your characters built on people you know at all, or are they completely 100%?
They're not. I thought I could shortcut it that way, but it's actually, I found it impossible to try to do that, to try to write people I know. Yeah, I saw a question here. In second row? Yeah.
You mentioned that The Hazel was your debut novel. Like, as a new novelist, how long did that process between finishing a draft to seeing it in stores? How long did that take, and like, what was that process like?
So I finished writing it. It took me like 2.5 years of stopping and starting, and then I finished it in like 2016. I got an agent, and I sold it in October 2016, and then it came out in January of 2018. So it was like, God, what was that? Like a year and change between finishing it, selling it, and then finally having it go on the shelves, which was a wild year and a half.
Yeah, is that jazzy? Is that can't tell?
I'll
Yeah.
let you pick. I'm making.
No, you're sorry.
I was just curious about like how you start your like world building process when you're writing novels.
Yeah, so I so far have, aside from the Hazelwood, which has like a portal world that I really enjoyed writing, I've written in this world. So I just love starting with a contemporary world and like adding in a creep of magic. So that is how I've done it. Like I've figured out settings that to me seem like inherently shadowy and strange, like the city and the suburbs. Just like there's something creepy about archetypes of any kind. Like you can like shade them with so much weirdness. So in the Hazelwood, it was like a city where every day you see different people, and like any stranger can like have some kind of menacing, ulterior motive. And then in Our Crooked Hearts, it's half in Chicago, half in the suburbs. And the suburbs, it's like you know everybody and you know every place so well that when that familiar starts to become strange, it's like super uncanny. So it's just finding ways to make familiar contemporary spaces creepy, which I'm always interested in.
Thank you.
Yeah,
I'm
thank
gonna
you.
let you take over the. You can
I'm
take
taking over? Okay. Hi.
You talked about what inspires your stories and characters, but can you explain what inspires maybe how things look?
Ooh. Yeah, I'm actually really bad at that. I'm bad at interiors. I'm bad at. I love to talk about how things smell, smell and taste and that. But like the actual, I will not describe characters' faces and appearances for like 2 or 3 drafts, and I have to like fit it in somewhere. So that's been. I love to describe, I guess, the look of like outdoor spaces, but interiors and people are a weak spot for me. So that always comes in edits, and I try to really pay attention when people do it well. Like, I don't know if you've read Rainbow Rowell at all, but her people when she just her people are phenomenal, like her characters like breathes. But when she describes what they look like, it's like, oh, it's so rich and idiosyncratic. And I'm not good at that. So I try to, all the things I'm weak at, I try to like notice because I want to get better. Yep.
Yeah. Wait, me?
What's that? You, yes.
So I have this like bad habit of like getting a good idea for a story, then like writing half a chapter and being, well, I'm done with you, and then completely ditching the whole story. So do you have any ideas as to like not do that?
Oh my gosh. So that is also my problem. And I talked a little bit about this in the last period. So you're going to get bored of an idea. And when you do, that's like probably, because I've done this 1,000 times, your brain telling you that you either don't know enough about the world or there's not enough to the idea to carry you through the full story. So one thing, if it's just that you don't know enough yet, then like doing exercises to kind of like learn about the world. Like one question a writer that I know asks is, in this world you've created, like if it's a fantasy world, what are the fairy tales people tell their children? Like what's the mythology of the world? Or like whatever it is. Or another way is if the idea doesn't feel big enough yet to become a whole story, it's possible you could like marry two ideas together. Like if you have, you know, a story about a girl in a city over here, like a story about like a boy and a whatever over here, like if they're cousins and the story is like about the two of them meeting. I don't know, I'm just riffing, but just the way you can like squash different stories together, you might end up finding the thing that's like big enough to want to live with. But yeah, it's incredibly hard to finish something. Yeah.
So it's a very similar setting, but have you read the Dresden Files? And
Ooh.
what do you think of it?
The Harry Dresden, right? Oh my gosh, I have the first one. I have not started it yet, but it has been recommended to me. It's about like a supernatural detective. Am I right?
Yes, but it's set in magic in Chicago.
Oh, all right. No wonder someone gave it to me. Yes, I have to read it. Thank you.
Has a publisher or editor ever suggested that you remove something or change something in your book that you really want to hold fast to? And how does that work?
So far, I've been working with the same editor through my career, and her edits are pretty much, she like asks questions and makes suggestions, but she has this feeling of like, your name is on the book. So she's never been overly pushy, which has been good. There was one thing she asked me to add that I knew was wrong, but it was my debut. So I wrote like a whole like 3-chapter spread to show her how bad it was. And she was like, yes, cut it. So, you know, I wouldn't do that again now that I'm a little more seasoned, but I feel like sometimes you have to prove that you're right. But I do have friends who've been forced into uncomfortable editing situations. So it's really about the good luck of landing with someone who cares to let your voice be like the main voice.
So you said that Hazel was your first book. What was it like seeing that for the first time?
Oh my God. Okay, so I think the most exciting moments was when I called my mom and told her I sold it. That was the best moment. And then seeing it in stores was like so bizarre. I'm just trying to remember. Yeah, it was so weird. It was like real. Yeah, it's emotional. Those moments, because like all this stuff happens and you're like anxious or whatever, and it all goes so fast. But then you can like slow down for a second and try to be like, wow. And that was a moment where I slowed down and said, wow. And it was actually, I went to the Barnes and Noble that used to be in the mall at Hawthorne, and like posed, you know, in front of the book, and I have all these photos of it. So it was good. It was a good moment.
We got about 2 minutes left.
When thinking of your story, do you have to think of the whole story before you write, or do you like keep adding to it as you go?
Definitely adding. I start with the smallest things. Our Crooked Heart started with the idea that I wanted to set fantasy in the suburbs. Like that was it. And I just started like what's creepy about the suburbs? Like what would I imagine when I used to be like driving around could happen like at night? So yeah, it started with setting. And the Hazelwood started with like voice. I wanted to write a female fantasy noir detective voice. but in like a fairy tale-ish fantasy. So yeah, the smallest thing, plus tons of work, and being super sad because you're not good enough yet, and forgiving yourself constantly.
Do you work with an illustrator for your covers, or do you do that on your own? How is it like working with an illustrator?
I've been really lucky. My publisher has a wonderful illustrator named Jim Tierney. If you look up his website, Jim Tierney, he like publishes some of the best covers around. He's so good. And so far, what's happened is they send me a cover and they're like, "What do you think?" And what they're saying is, "This is your cover." And I'm like, "I think we should change it." And they're like, "No, bye." So luckily, all the covers have been really good, and they'll take my tiny edits. But mostly, it's like presented to me, and I have to learn to love it. And I've been lucky because it's been easy to like love my covers. We have time for one more? Okay.
Each time you write a new book, does the process get easier the more knowledge you kind of gain?
No. I think what's happening is the more I know, the more I realize I don't know. Sorry guys, it does not get easier, but it's all worth it. Thank you for asking. Bye.
Thanks, guys. Have a great break.